I needed a break. Working 60-hour weeks in downtown Seattle had me burning out fast, grinding my nerves down to a fine dust. So when I found a listing for a secluded A-frame cabin deep in the Cascades, I booked it immediately. The host, David, had glowing reviews, and the photos showed this gorgeous, modern cabin with massive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out into pristine, untouched forest. It looked like the ultimate reset button. The drive up there was long and lonely. The paved highway eventually gave way to a two-lane county road, which ultimately turned into a deeply rutted, winding dirt path that my sedan barely handled. For the last 40 minutes of the drive, I didn't see another car, a house, or even a power line. The pine trees up there don't just line the road, they loom over it, creating this suffocating, heavy canopy that completely blotted out the late afternoon sun. By the time my cell service completely died, I was navigating purely by the offline screenshot instructions David had messaged me the day before. I finally pulled into a small gravel clearing just as dusk was settling in. The cabin was exactly as pictured. A stunning, sharp A-frame with a vast wall of glass making up the entire front facade. But standing there in the fading gray light, grabbing my duffel bag from the trunk, the isolation hit me like a physical weight. The silence was absolute. There was no highway hum, no birds chirping, just the loud, abrasive crunch of my own boots on the gravel. I unlocked the front door using the keypad code David provided. Inside, it looked like a magazine spread. Warm cedar walls, a plush leather sofa, a wood-burning stove, and a sleek little kitchen. I tossed my bag on the couch and did the obligatory walkthrough. Upstairs was an open loft bedroom overlooking the living space, and downstairs was the main living area, kitchen, and a short hallway leading to the bathroom. That's where I noticed the first thing that felt off. At the very end of that short hallway, just past the bathroom, was a door. It hadn't been in any of the listing photos. Unlike the hollow-core, aesthetically pleasing wooden doors used for the bathroom and the coat closet, this one was heavy, solid steel. It was painted a dull utilitarian gray and had a massive commercial-grade deadbolt on it. I tried the handle just out of curiosity. Locked tight. I figured it was just an owner's closet, where David kept cleaning supplies or his own personal gear. Still, it felt weirdly out of place, almost industrial in such a carefully curated space. I shrugged it off, unpacked my clothes, and made myself a quick dinner. The cabin had no cell service, which I expected, but the listing promised high-speed satellite Wi-Fi and a landline for emergencies. I connected my phone to the network and texted my brother to let him know I'd made it up the mountain alive. He texted back a minute later, "Enjoy the creepy woods, don't get eaten." I chuckled, typed out a sarcastic reply, and hit send. The message hung there on the screen. The little blue progress bar froze halfway. Message failed to send. I checked the Wi-Fi icon at the top of my phone. Disconnected. I walked over to the router sitting on the kitchen counter. The green indicator lights were completely gone. Unplugging it and plugging it back in did nothing. The router wasn't just dropping the signal. The power to that specific outlet was completely dead. I sighed in frustration, turning around to look out the massive A-frame windows. It's a beautiful design feature during the day, but at night, a glass house is just a glowing terrarium. With the interior lights on, the glass acted like a giant mirror reflecting the brightly lit living room, making it absolutely impossible to see into the pitch-black woods outside. I felt completely exposed. But as I stood there, staring at my own reflection in the dark glass, something else caught my eye. Over my left shoulder, reflected in the window, was the hallway, and the dull gray steel door that I had checked only an hour ago was now standing open by about 2 inches. My stomach hit the floor. The air in my lungs just vanished. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the reflection in the glass. The heavy steel door at the end of the hall, the one I had physically tried and found locked solid, was definitively cracked open. A thin slice of absolute blackness broke up the warm cedar-paneled reflection of the hallway. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The door was closed. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. I looked back at the window reflection. Closed. I walked slowly down the short hallway, my footsteps sounding entirely too loud in the dead silent cabin. When I reached the gray door, I leaned in close. The air seeping from the cracks around the frame felt noticeably colder than the rest of the house, and there was a faint, distinct smell hanging right outside it. Not dust or old wood, but something sour, like stale sweat mixed with a heavy, cheap drugstore cologne. I grabbed the heavy metal handle and twisted, locked tight, unmoving. "You're losing it," I told myself, letting out a shaky breath. I blamed it on exhaustion, the long drive, and the optical illusion of reflecting a brightly lit room against the pitch-black night. It was just a weird shadow. It had to be. Trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, I went back to the living room. Since the Wi-Fi was dead, I couldn't stream anything, so I pulled up a movie I'd downloaded on my laptop. I curled up on the leather sofa, pulling a woven throw blanket over my legs. I tried to focus on the dialogue, but my eyes kept darting to the massive A-frame windows. If you've never been in a house made almost entirely of glass at night in the deep woods, let me tell you, it is deeply unsettling. You can't see a single thing past the glass. It's just an endless, suffocating wall of ink. But anyone, or anything, standing out there in the dark has a perfect, high-definition view of everything you are doing. You are basically a fish in a glowing bowl. I was about 40 minutes into the movie when the room outside suddenly flashed. Click. A glaring, harsh white light flooded the front deck and illuminated the first row of pine trees outside. I jumped, my laptop nearly sliding off my knees. It was an outdoor motion sensor floodlight mounted high up on the exterior apex of the roof. I muted my laptop and listened. Nothing, just the faint, distant whistle of wind through the pines. I stood up and walked to the edge of the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out the glare from the living room lamps so I could see out into the yard. The floodlight bathed the wooden deck in the immediate brush in stark surgical white. There was no raccoon, no deer, no stray branch swinging in the wind, just empty space and the skeletal trunks of the closest trees bleeding off into the dark. After about 2 minutes, the timer ran out. Click. Plunged right back into the suffocating black. "Just an animal," I whispered to the empty room. "Just a stray branch." I went back to the couch and unmuted my movie, trying to force my heart rate down. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I was just starting to relax again, my shoulders finally dropping away from my ears. Click. The blinding white light flooded the trees again. This time, I didn't get up. I just sat there, staring out at the illuminated patch of forest, feeling a cold knot form in my gut. I watched the tree line intently, looking for any movement. Nothing. The light flicked off. 2 minutes of suffocating darkness. Click. It turned back on. My breath hitched. It wasn't a glitch. Something, or someone, was moving back and forth just along the edge of the tree line, deliberately stepping in and out of the sensor's range. The floodlight clicked on and off 3 more times over the next hour. Each time I held my breath, my eyes straining against the harsh glare, frantically searching the illuminated brush for a face, a shape, a shadow. Nothing. Just the slow, mocking sway of the pine branches. By 2 a.m., the clicking finally stopped. The woods remained drowned in absolute heavy darkness. I didn't finish the movie. Instead, I quietly slid off the couch, crept into the kitchen, and pulled a heavy 8-inch chef's knife from the wooden block on the counter. Feeling utterly ridiculous but unable to stop myself, I carried it upstairs to the loft bedroom. The loft didn't have a door to lock, it just had a low railing overlooking the living room and the massive glass wall below, but being elevated gave me a slight sense of security. I lay rigid on the mattress, the knife resting on the nightstand, jolting awake at every minor creak and groan of the settling timber. When daylight finally broke, washing the cabin in a soft, misty gray morning light, my midnight terror evaporated. It's amazing how the sun can make you feel like a paranoid idiot. I sat up, looked out at the gorgeous serene forest, and actually laughed out loud at the knife on the nightstand. I was a city guy spooked by a deer. That was it. Since the outlet powering the router was still mysteriously dead, I plugged the coffee maker into the bathroom outlet, brewed a cup, and stepped out onto the front wooden deck to get some fresh air. The morning air was biting and smelled sharply of wet earth and pine needles. I walked to the edge of the deck, leaning over the railing to look at the patch of brush the floodlight had illuminated the night before. I expected to see deer tracks, or maybe the disturbed dirt of a raccoon foraging for grubs. Instead, I saw a clear, distinct set of boot prints. They were stamped into the damp, muddy earth just a few feet beyond the edge of the wooden deck. They were large, maybe a size 12 or 13, with a heavy, flat tread. Not the deep lugs of a hiking boot, but the wide, smooth pattern of a work boot. My heart did a slow, painful rollover. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They didn't pass by the cabin. They didn't wander off toward the trash cans. They came from the deep tree line, stopped dead in the mud directly facing the cabin, and then retreated the exact same way they came. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing through. They had stood right at the edge of the light's sensor range, toes pointed dead center at the glass wall. They had been watching me watch the movie. A cold sweat broke across my neck. I needed to leave. I decided right then I didn't care about the money. I was packing my bags and driving back to Seattle. I stepped off the deck to quickly trace the path of the footprints around the side of the house, wanting to make sure nobody was lingering near my parked car. As I walked along the exterior wall of the cabin, my eyes dragged along the length of the roof, and that's when I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked at the long, continuous slope of the A-frame roof stretching from the front deck all the way to the back of the structure. It was a long building, at least 50 feet from front to back. But the inside wasn't 50 feet deep. The main living room was maybe 20 feet long. The kitchen and the short hallway leading to the bathroom added maybe another 15. That was 35 tops. I stared at the back half of the exterior of the cabin, my mind struggling to process the math. There was at least 15 feet of solid structure at the back of this house that simply did not exist on the inside. 15 feet of entirely unaccounted for space sitting right behind that heavy, locked steel door. My brain scrambled to find a logical architectural explanation. A utility room? A massive water heater? A storage space for a riding mower? But 15 by 20 feet. That wasn't a closet. That was the size of a master bedroom. I followed the sloping exterior wall all the way to the back of the cabin, the wet grass soaking the bottom of my jeans. The forest encroached much closer here, the heavy pine branches scraping softly against the dark brown siding. The rear of the A-frame was a sheer, windowless triangle of wood, but as I pushed through a thick cluster of damp ferns to inspect the stone foundation, my breath hitched in my throat. Hidden behind a meticulously stacked 6-foot-high cord of firewood was a narrow gravel pathway, and tucked into the deep perpetual shadow of the eaves was a secondary exterior door. It was painted the exact same dark brown as the siding, clearly designed to be completely camouflaged unless you knew exactly where to look. I crouched down, a wave of nausea washing over me. The ground in front of this hidden door was a mess of churned-up dirt. The same wide, flat boot prints from the front yard were everywhere here, overlapping in a chaotic, heavily trafficked pattern. But the most horrifying detail wasn't the prints themselves. It was the mud on the wooden threshold. It was still glistening and wet. It hadn't rained since the early hours of the morning. Someone hadn't just been out in the woods last night. Someone had been coming in and out of the back of the house while I was sleeping just a few walls away. Pure, unadulterated adrenaline dumped into my bloodstream. My fight-or-flight response didn't just kick in, it screamed at me to run. Forget the relaxing weekend, forget the Airbnb deposit. The beautiful, aesthetic A-frame suddenly felt like a very elaborate, very isolated trap. I was leaving immediately. I scrambled back around to the front of the cabin, my boots slipping on the slick grass. I vaulted up the deck stairs and shoved the front door open, throwing my weight against it to lock the deadbolt behind me out of pure instinct. The warm cedar-scented air of the interior, which had felt so cozy yesterday, now felt suffocating. I sprinted up the stairs to the loft and started shoving my things into my duffel bag with trembling, clumsy hands. Clothes, my toothbrush, my laptop charger. I didn't care how it fit, I just jammed it all in, practically tearing the zipper. I grabbed the heavy chef's knife from the nightstand, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white, and threw myself back down the wooden staircase. Keys, 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 I muttered frantically, scanning the kitchen island. I had tossed them right next to the dead Wi-Fi router when I first arrived. They were right where I left them. I snatched them up, a brief, intoxicating wave of relief washing over me. I just needed to get to the car. I could be back on the paved highway in 40 minutes. But as I turned away from the kitchen to head for the front door, my boots stopped dead on the hardwood floor. The faint, sour smell of stale sweat and cheap chemical cologne was back. It was much stronger this time, hanging heavily in the stagnant air of the living room, completely overpowering the smell of my morning coffee. I slowly turned my head, my eyes locking onto the short hallway leading to the bathroom. The heavy, gray steel door at the end of the hall, the door that sealed off the hidden 15 feet of the cabin, was no longer perfectly flush with the frame. It was cracked open again. But this time I knew it wasn't a shadow or an optical illusion. Tucked neatly beneath the bottom corner, resting on the floorboards, was a small wooden wedge, deliberately placed there to prop the heavy door open from the inside. The wedge. A simple, triangular piece of cheap pine. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It meant the heavy steel door hadn't just drifted open on a draft. It meant whoever belonged to those massive work boots, whoever smelled like that sour, chemical cologne, had physically propped it open. And they had done it while I was upstairs frantically packing my bag. They were inside the cabin, right now. My lungs seized up, refusing to draw air. I stood anchored to the hardwood floor, my eyes glued to that 2-inch slice of absolute darkness at the end of the hall. I tightened my grip on the chef's knife until my forearm cramped. Every survival instinct screamed at me to turn and sprint through the front door, to throw myself into my car and tear down the mountain. But the dirt road was a 40-minute treacherous crawl. If he had tampered with my tires, or if he had laid a trap on that narrow, one-way exit route, I'd be a sitting duck in the middle of nowhere. I needed the police on the way before I got behind the wheel. I kept my body squared toward the hallway, never breaking visual contact with that cracked steel door, and slowly backed up toward the front entrance, step by agonizingly slow step. The leather sofa, the coffee table, the kitchen island, I navigated backward by memory. My left hand blindly swiped along the cedar-paneled wall next to the front door until my fingers brushed the hard plastic of the wall-mounted landline phone. I snatched the receiver off the hook, my thumb mashing the keypad. I didn't even wait to bring it to my ear. I just kept pressing. 911. Silence. I pressed the receiver hard against my ear, praying for the steady, robotic hum of a dial tone. There was nothing, not even a crackle of static. It was just dead, empty air. I pulled the phone away and looked at the base on the wall. The cord that was supposed to plug into the bottom jack was dangling freely. It hadn't just been unplugged. The thin wire had been cleanly snipped off. A wave of intense dizziness hit me. No cell service. No Wi-Fi, no landline. I was completely, utterly severed from the rest of the world. I dropped the useless receiver. It hit the floorboards with a loud plastic clatter that made me flinch. As I looked down at the severed cord, the morning sunlight streaming through the massive A-frame windows caught a reflection on the ceiling. I glanced up. Directly above the leather sofa, right where I had spent 3 hours last night staring blindly into the dark woods, was a standard white smoke detector. But tucked into the small, slotted plastic vent on its side was a tiny, unnatural glint of glass. A camera lens. It was angled perfectly downward to capture the entire living room. My stomach violently churned. The fishbowl feeling from last night took on a whole new, horrifying dimension. He hadn't just been watching me from the tree line. He had been watching me from inside his own walls. He had watched me pace around. He had watched me grab the knife from the kitchen. He knew exactly how terrified I was, and he was reveling in it. I swallowed the sharp taste of bile rising in my throat and reached blindly behind me, my fingers finding the cold metal of the front door's deadbolt. I just needed to twist it, yank the door open, and run for my car. I wrapped my fingers around the lock and started to turn it. Creak. The sound echoed sharply from the short hallway. It was slow, heavy, and unmistakable. The agonizing groan of a wooden floorboard protesting under a massive amount of weight. Someone had just stepped out from behind the steel door. I stopped breathing. The half-turned deadbolt under my fingers felt as cold as ice. The silence in the cabin was so absolute that the rushing blood in my ears sounded like a roaring river. Creak. Another step. It was agonizingly slow, deliberate, and heavy. The floorboards just past the bathroom protested loudly. He wasn't trying to hide his approach anymore. The psychological game was shifting. He knew I was leaving, and he was coming down the hall. The sour, chemical stench of his cologne rolled into the living room, thick and nauseating. I watched in paralyzed horror as a shadow began to stretch across the sunlit hardwood floor, bleeding out from the hallway. It was massive, broad-shouldered and looming, distorting as it dragged across the cedar planks. Pure, blinding adrenaline snapped me out of my trance. I didn't wait to see a face. I didn't wait to see if he had a weapon. I violently wrenched the deadbolt the rest of the way, grabbed the handle, and threw my entire body weight backward. The heavy wooden front door flew open, slamming against the exterior siding with a deafening crack. I burst out onto the front deck and launched myself down the stairs, clearing them in a single desperate jump. My boots hit the gravel driveway hard, kicking up rocks as I sprinted toward my sedan. It was parked exactly where I left it, 40 feet away, pointed toward the long, winding dirt road that led back to civilization. My thumb mashed the unlock button on my key fob as I ran. The familiar beep-beep of the car unlocking was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I yanked the driver's side door open, hurled my body into the seat, and slammed the door shut, immediately hitting the power locks. I was hyperventilating, my hands shaking so violently I dropped the keys into the passenger seat. I scrambled to grab them, my eyes darting frantically between the steering column and the wide-open front door of the cabin. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it hard. Click, 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 click. The engine didn't even try to turn over, just the hollow, rapid-fire clicking of a completely dead starter. "No, no, no, come on," I screamed, slamming my palm against the steering wheel. I twisted the key again, and again. Nothing, not a single spark of life. My eyes shot to the dashboard. No warning lights, no radio glow, complete electrical failure. That's when my gaze drifted just past the steering wheel, out the windshield. The hood of my car wasn't sitting flush. There was a subtle, half-inch gap running along the seam. The latch had been popped. He hadn't just been wandering around the tree line last night playing with the motion lights. He had been systematically disabling my only way out. A suffocating wave of despair crashed over me. I was trapped inside a metal box in the middle of a forest that he knew intimately. I slowly looked up from the popped hood and stared back at the A-frame cabin. Standing perfectly still on the front deck, framed by the open doorway, was the man. He was dressed entirely in dark, grimy hunting gear, his face completely obscured by a tightly knit dark green ski mask. He was at least 6'4", with a heavy, thick build that easily explained the groaning floorboards. He wasn't rushing the car. He wasn't yelling. He was just standing there on the wooden planks, staring me right through the windshield, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. Then he slowly raised his left hand, Clutched in his thick, leather-gloved fist was a severed tangle of thick copper wires, my battery cables. He stared right at me for a long, agonizing second, and then casually tossed them off the deck into the damp ferns. And then his right hand reached behind his back and pulled out a long, rusted splitting maul. He stepped off the wooden deck, his heavy boots making a dull thud against the planks. The rusted head of the splitting maul scraped against the porch railing, sending a sickening shiver down my spine. I was trapped in a metal coffin. My fingers tightened around the handle of the chef's knife so hard my joints ached. I kept my eyes locked on him, mentally calculating the distance. If he smashed the driver's side window, I'd have exactly 1 second to thrust the blade into his neck before he caved my skull in. He didn't rush. That was the worst part of it all. He walked across the gravel driveway with a slow, agonizing swagger. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He stopped right at the front bumper of my sedan. I braced myself, raising the knife, my breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He didn't swing at the windshield. Instead, he raised the heavy maul above his head and brought it down with terrifying, brutal force straight into the front driver's side tire. Bang! A violent hiss of pressurized air erupted, and the car jerked downward, dropping toward the gravel. He casually pulled the maul free, the rusted metal tearing the rubber further, and took a slow, deliberate walk around the vehicle. Bang! The passenger front tire blew. Bang! The rear tire. He was systematically crippling the car, physically anchoring me to the property. He wasn't just trapping me, he was playing with his food. After the final tire hissed flat, he walked back around to my window. He leaned down, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun. Even through the glass, I could smell it, that putrid, sour stench of cheap cologne and unwashed clothes. Through the frayed, stretched holes of his ski mask, his eyes locked onto mine. They were pale, wide, and entirely devoid of anything human. It was the blank, detached stare of a butcher looking at a slab of meat. He slowly raised a thick, leather-gloved finger, pointed toward the long, winding dirt road that led back to civilization, and wagged it back and forth. Don't even try it. Then he hoisted the maul onto his shoulder, turned his back to me, and walked past the cabin. He didn't go back inside. He just stepped into the dense, shadowy brush of the pine forest and completely melted into the trees. I sat in the lopsided car, hyperventilating. My mind raced through the options. I could run, but the dirt road was a 40-mile stretch of exposed gravel. He knew the terrain, I didn't. He wanted me out there. It was a hunter's shooting gallery, and I'd be dead before I made it 2 miles. My only option, my only completely insane, terrifying option, was to go back inside. The cabin had sturdy walls. If I could secure the entry points, I could hold out. Maybe a park ranger would drive by. Maybe the owner had a local property manager. It was a pathetic, microscopic hope, but it was all I had left. I gripped the knife, kicked my car door open, and sprinted back up the deck stairs. I slammed the front door behind me, instantly throwing the deadbolt. My adrenaline was burning so hot I barely felt the weight of the furniture as I dragged the heavy oak coffee table across the floor, wedging it fiercely against the doorframe. Next was the hallway. I ran to the back, kicked his little wooden wedge away, and slammed the heavy gray steel door shut. I locked its deadbolt, then threw my entire body weight against the kitchen island. The massive butcher block cart rolled on its casters, and I jammed it securely under the steel door's handle, creating a makeshift heavy-duty barricade. I stood in the center of the living room, panting heavily, sweat stinging my eyes. The doors were secure. But as I turned around, my false sense of safety instantly evaporated. I was staring at the massive, floor-to-ceiling A-frame windows. The gray afternoon sky was already deepening into a bruised, heavy purple. The sun was going down fast, and as the shadows rapidly stretched across the floorboards, I realized my fatal mistake. I had locked myself inside a glass box, and the cabin's lights were still on. I scrambled across the living room like a madman, violently slapping at every light switch I could find. Click, click, click. I yanked the cords of the standing lamps directly out of their wall sockets, not even bothering with the knobs. I needed the interior of this glass box to be darker than the woods outside, or I was just a glowing, high-definition target waiting for him to throw that rusted splitting maul right through the window panes. Within seconds, the cabin was plunged into heavy, suffocating darkness. The only illumination came from the dying, bruised purple light of the dusk filtering through the pines. I retreated backward up the wooden stairs to the loft, my hands trembling as I gripped the heavy chef's knife. From the loft railing, I had a vantage point of the entire first floor, the barricaded front door, the massive wall of glass, and the kitchen island shoved tightly against the gray steel door at the back. I sat on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest, straining my eyes against the gloom. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to crush my lungs. I waited for the inevitable crash of breaking glass. I waited for the heavy thud of his boots on the front deck. But nothing happened. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Total, agonizing silence. It was a siege, and he was perfectly content to wait me out in the freezing woods. As my eyes finally adjusted to the pitch-black interior, I looked up toward the vaulted ceiling. Directly above the living room, the smoke detector blinked. But it wasn't the standard intermittent green flash of a battery check. It was a faint, unbroken ring of tiny crimson dots surrounding the plastic vent. Infrared. Night vision. My stomach violently contracted. Turning off the lights hadn't hidden me at all. He was out there in the dark, staring at a monitor, watching me huddle in the loft like a terrified rat. He knew exactly where I was. I slid onto my stomach and crawled backward until I was pressed flush against the wooden railing of the loft, trying to break his camera's line of sight. The wood was cold against my sweating cheek. I squeezed the knife handle, praying for the outdoor motion sensor lights to click on and give away his position in the tree line. Instead, a sound echoed through the cabin that made my blood run instantly cold. It wasn't a branch scraping the siding, and it wasn't a footstep on the exterior deck. It was a slow, metallic screech. Skk. It came from directly beneath me, not from the locked room at the end of the hall, but from under the floorboards of the main living area. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the loft floor. Skk. Thump. He wasn't outside waiting. He hadn't retreated into the woods to freeze. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The 15 feet of dead space behind the steel door didn't just contain a hidden ground-level room. It contained an access point to the cabin's crawl space. While I was frantically barricading the heavy doors, he had simply walked around to the back, let himself into his hidden entrance, and crawled right underneath me. I peered over the edge of the loft, staring down into the pitch-black living room. Near the base of the massive A-frame windows, built directly into the hardwood floor, was a large slated cast-iron heating register meant to circulate warm air from the wood stove. As I watched, completely paralyzed by a fresh wave of terror, the heavy iron grate slowly lifted upward, pushed from below by a thick, leather-gloved hand. Screech that set my teeth on edge. It landed heavily on the hardwood floor with a dull clang. From my vantage point, pressed flat against the loft railing, I watched in paralyzed horror as a massive pair of shoulders squeezed up through the narrow opening in the floorboards. It was a tight fit, and I could hear him grunting, a wet, guttural sound that was entirely too loud in the dead silent cabin. He pulled himself up with terrifying strength, his heavy work boots finally clearing the floor register. As he stood to his full towering height, he eclipsed the faint, bruised purple light filtering in from the massive A-frame windows. He was nothing but a hulking black silhouette in the gloom. And the smell, that nauseating mixture of stale sweat, damp earth, and cheap cologne, billowed up to the loft in an invisible, choking cloud. He didn't search the first floor. He didn't even check the barricaded front door. He just slowly turned his masked face upward, looking directly at the loft railing. Because of the infrared camera hidden in the smoke detector, he knew exactly where I was. He took a step toward the wooden staircase. Creak. He didn't rush. He placed one heavy boot on the first step, then dragged the rusted head of the splitting maul up behind him, thud. Another step. Creak, thud. He was savoring it. He was a predator who had successfully cornered his prey in a trap of the prey's own making. The loft was a dead end. There were no windows up here, no secondary doors, just a steep drop down to the living room below. If I stayed, I was going to die. If I tried to fight a man that size with an 8-inch kitchen knife in close quarters, I was going to die. Creak, thud. He was halfway up the stairs. The absolute darkness hid his features, but I could hear the erratic, heavy rhythm of his breathing. Pure, blinding survival instinct hijacked my brain. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed the heavy, solid oak nightstand beside the bed, hoisted it up with a sudden burst of frantic adrenaline, and hurled it down the staircase directly at his massive silhouette. There was a sickening crunch of wood meeting bone, followed by a startled, animalistic roar. The massive shadow tumbled backward, crashing down the lower half of the stairs in a chaotic tangle of heavy limbs and splintering oak. I didn't wait for him to hit the bottom. I threw my legs over the wooden railing of the loft and dropped. It was a 10-foot fall. I hit the living room floor agonizingly hard, my left ankle rolling inward with a sharp, blinding crack of pain that stole the breath from my lungs. I collapsed onto the hardwood, biting my lips so hard I tasted copper to keep from screaming. "You're dead," a voice bellowed from the dark pile of debris by the stairs. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sheer volume and rasp of his voice vibrated in my chest. I scrambled on my hands and knees, clutching the chef's knife, my bad ankle dragging uselessly behind me. I reached the front door, but the massive oak coffee table I had wedged against it was immovable. I had trapped myself. Behind me, I heard the terrifying sound of heavy boots finding their footing again. He was standing up. I spun around, spotting one of the heavy steel-framed dining chairs near the kitchen island. I grabbed it by the backrest, ignored the screaming pain in my leg, and hobbled toward the only exit left, the massive, floor-to-ceiling wall of glass. With a scream of pure, raw terror, I threw myself headfirst through the jagged hole, just as a heavy, rusted metal blade buried itself into the wooden window frame, exactly where my head had been a fraction of a second before. I hit the wooden deck hard, sliding through a carpet of shattered glass that sliced through my jeans and bit into my palms. Above me, I heard the brutal, splintering wrench of the splitting maul being yanked free from the wooden window frame. I didn't look back. I forced myself up, ignoring the agonizing, fiery stab in my left ankle, and threw myself off the edge of the deck directly into the freezing, pitch-black tree line. The darkness of the woods was absolute. I was running entirely blind, my hands outstretched, branches whipping across my face and tearing at my jacket. Every step on my ruined ankle sent a wave of nausea up my throat, but the sound of heavy boots crunching onto the glass-covered deck behind me pushed me forward. "You can't see out here," his voice boomed into the night, dripping with a sick, mocking glee. "But I can." My heart stopped. He either had thermodeer or he was bluffing to flush me out. Running aimlessly through his woods was suicide. I veered sharply to the right, throwing myself into a deep ravine choked with damp ferns. I slid down the muddy embankment and wedged myself under the hollowed-out root system of a massive fallen pine, clamping both hands over my mouth. Minutes dragged like hours. The freezing mud seeped through my clothes. From the ridge above, I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of his boots. The sweeping beam of a heavy-duty flashlight suddenly cut through the canopy. He wasn't using night vision after all. He was just trying to panic me. As the beam swept past my hiding spot, it briefly illuminated something metallic 50 yards down the ravine, a shape that didn't belong in the woods. It was a battered dark green pickup truck, parked on a hidden, overgrown logging trail that bypassed the main driveway entirely. His truck. I waited until the flashlight beam swept in the opposite direction. Then I crawled. I dragged my ruined ankle through the mud, pulling myself forward by the roots until I reached the rear bumper. The driver's side door was unlocked. I pulled myself up, slipped inside the cab, and gently closed the door. The interior smelled intensely of that nauseating sour cologne. I frantically patted down the steering column. No keys. I checked the cup holder, then flipped down the sun visor. A heavy metal key ring dropped directly into my lap. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the key into the ignition and twisted. The old engine roared to life with a deafening mechanical scream that echoed through the entire forest. Instantly, the flashlight in the woods snapped frantically toward the truck. Through the dirty windshield, I saw his massive silhouette charging down the embankment, the splitting maul raised high above his head. I slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped the gas pedal to the floor. The truck fishtailed violently, the heavy mud tires biting into the dirt, and launched forward. I heard a dull, heavy thud against the tailgate as he missed his swing, and then I was flying blindly down the unlit logging road, bouncing violently until the tires finally hit the main gravel path. I didn't stop driving until I hit the paved highway. I didn't stop then either until I reached a brightly lit 24-hour gas station 20 miles away, where I collapsed out of the cab and screamed for the attendant to call the police. The authorities swarmed the mountain that night, but the man was long gone by the time they breached the A-frame. What they found, however, still keeps me awake every single night. The dead space behind the steel door wasn't just a crawl space access. It was a fully furnished, soundproofed room of surveillance. The walls were lined with monitors connected to hidden cameras inside the smoke detectors, the bathroom vents, and the bedroom mirrors. Worse, they found a wall of filing cabinets. Inside were dozens of meticulously kept journals detailing the habits, schedules, and private moments of every single person who had rented the cabin over the last 3 years. In a locked floor safe, they found a collection of wallets and IDs belonging to hikers who had gone missing in the county. The police never caught him. The property had been bought through a shell corporation, and the host profile for David was a complete fabrication. He is still out there. And sometimes, when I'm lying in my secure, brightly lit city apartment, I swear I can still catch the faint, sour scent of cheap drugstore cologne drifting from the air vents.